The views and opinions expressed in our program are those of the speakers and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent. All rights reserved. Hello, and welcome to our special edition series, SDGs and What You Need to Know. Together, we will be explaining and discussing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Our mission is to educate everyday citizens about SDGs, what they are, what they mean, how the laws and policies that are and have been passed can and will affect us, not only here in Canada, but around the world. Additionally, by learning and understanding these 17 goals, we can all become one step closer in helping to affect change in this world from a grassroots perspective. Let's get started with Sustainable Development Goal number 14, Life Below Water. Goal 14 is about conserving and sustainably using the oceans, seas, and marine resources. Healthy oceans and seas are essential to human existence and life on Earth. They cover 70% of the planet and provide food, energy, and water. The ocean absorbs around 1/4 of the world's annual carbon dioxide emissions, thereby mitigating climate change and alleviating its impacts. It is essential to conserve and sustainably use them, yet human activity is endangering the oceans and seas, the planet's largest ecosystem, and affecting the livelihoods of billions of people. At this time, I'd like to turn the mic over to Mark for further discussion.
Yeah, so here we go with a little bit more, control and hyper centralization of everything. So, excuse me, not only do they want to control, all aspects of our life, but they want to control life in the oceans. And of course, they mentioned that human activity is hurting ocean life. Again, it runs contradictory to reality. The reality is humans are part of nature. Um, we exist on this planet, rightfully so, as all other animals do and all other forms of life. So we're not an exception, and but they want to treat us like we're an exception, that it's our activity that is harming the planet. And I disagree. I think we contribute a lot to this planet and to life on planet Earth. And again, this idea that they're going to control, yeah, I assume in this they're talking, when they're speaking of human activity, I guess they're talking about shipping and fishing and boating and all these types of activities that humans use the oceans for. So what is it that we're going to do? I question what it is that they want to actually do. Do they want to limit our ability to transport um, goods to other nations, to other continents, by restricting our ability to transport our goods via the oceans and the seas? I'm not sure exactly what their plan is here. Obviously, um, fishing. I can understand that. I can understand how that impacts life below the surface in the oceans. Obviously, we don't want to overfish, but I think we can fish, um, using their language, sustainably. I think we've proven that we can do that. Um, so I'm not really sure, to be honest with you. I mean, other than the bigger picture that they want to control, all aspects of our life, including whatever activity we take part in the oceans. Does that mean that we can't drill for oil anymore in the oceans? Does that mean they want to restrict, how we transport our goods and export, our natural resources that the world wants and needs? Um, that seems counterproductive. That seems counterintuitive. Um, I again, if we're going to allow this supranational globalist entity to continue to dictate the terms of our life and our um, activities, we're in for a world of hurt. And again, I think if humans are left to their own devices, that we can manage a lot of the problems that you know are either real or imagined that this group that created this agenda has brought forward. So um, yeah, I'd like to hear a few of the targets, and some of the things that they want to achieve in this goal.
Well, when you speak to the targets, when you read them, they're really on a once again sugar coated, and they do make a lot of sense. But what doesn't make sense is you got your private and public partnerships again, which equate to large corporations of fishing, large corporations of oil drilling, large corporations of everything, right? We've seen this on the Atlantic coast in Canada. It wasn't your mom and pop fishing operations that were going out and overfishing and blah 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 blah. It's when the big corporations moved in with all the money and resources, and they just basically pillaged it, and they become wasteful, as we talked about in these, sustainable food. It's the same thing. These big corporations are not efficient. They don't do things, really efficient about moving their product, getting their product to market, like your mom and pop operations did. And so this is why we're seeing in the oceans. It's just another aspect of what they want to control. They want to control every inch of the planet and everything and every resource. They don't want people doing anything because they want the corporations doing it because they know better. And they got their basically bureaucrats that are, telling them this stuff, and they're not listening to people that are on the ground that actually, like in agriculture, as we did before, they're not listening to farmers about what we see. We're the guys that basically get down on our hands and knees and scratch our seed an inch and a half down every year and look at it, and we can see, and we're the ones doing the soil samples and so on and so forth. But they will not take that data. It's just what government, because they're official. So basically, I would say that data is basically really, really um, stacked one way to fill an agenda, to fill a narrative that they're looking for, and a perspective, and basically tell lies to fill their goals. So that's what my perspective of reading through the targets.
Yeah, so I'd like to add a couple of things just so our audience understands what we're actually talking about here. So about 3/4 of the planet is covered by water, 71%. Of that, only 35% has been mapped, and of that, we have 5% that's actually been explored. So this is vast expanses that we have no idea what's actually there. We haven't really investigated beyond sailing a ship over it, or an airplane or a drone or something like that. So the fact that you want to manage something that is 71% of the global surface, we are just looking at massive, massive scales here, uncharted territory, and they want to regulate it. How do you plan on imposing regulations on these vast expanses? And Mark, you talked about resources, and I see this as landlocking resources. You look at the tanker ban that we have off the coast of British Columbia. We can take foreign oil in, but we can't ship domestic oil out. Uh, you know, Huge things that we are again stifling Canadian and Western economies. This is a big deal. The other thing that I want to kind of highlight here, because we talk about sustainability, sustained fisheries and all those kinds of things. I think we're very good at what we've done, what we do. We look at the salmon off of the New Brunswick area. We had lots of, overpopulation by my estimations, and then we brought it down further than what was sustainable. But we've rebuilt those stocks, and we have a thriving fishing industry right now. The lobster, again, Canada is known for the best lobster around, and we're doing it sustainably, and we're producing profits and a livelihood and sustaining families.
I think it's important. This is a good point, maybe to discuss how they manage to convince, like, we joke about the left coast and Vancouver and Vancouver Island and it being, very, very left leaning, we'll say. But it's interesting how they manage to propagandize, the tanker ban, for example, and how they manage to actually implement that with, you know, the agreement of the people. And again, it's this idea that, you know, it's so beautiful on the coast of BC, and there's so much wildlife that we hate to ruin it with tankers. Well, I don't think you're ruining anything with tankers. I think tankers have a role to play, and um, a lot of this I think is tied into the whole pipeline issue and getting our resources to Tidewater, so then we can export that resource, to where the world needs it and wants it. So I think it's tied to a lot of that. I think, this tanker ban basically gives them license to say, well, what's the point in running pipelines to Tidewater if there's no ships allowed to sail on the coast of British Columbia? So I think it's tied into that, and I think a lot of it is, again, it's propaganda, where the Soros of the world and his organization, Open Society, and they fund a lot of the useful idiots that are able to manipulate public opinion through their activities, through their protests and what have you. And I think, because they're so well funded, that they're very effective, and they're allowed to, manipulate public opinion in the direction they need it to go. So we have to understand that there's, a lot of this is at play because of big money and folks like Soros and others who sponsor these useful idiots, in their campaign to sway public opinion in their direction, and it's very effective. And so, we have to. I think we have to understand that this is a mechanism on how they achieve these things by changing public opinion. So the public opinion is, yeah, let's shut down tankers, without really realizing, you know, and this is a big difference between, folks way over there on the left and folks on the right, is we've never taken a responsibility to protest until COVID. And then all of a sudden, people on the right, people who appreciate freedom, all of a sudden got activated. And you can see a lot of people, even within the conservative envelope, are still sort of wondering, that's not what we do. And we have to change that mindset, because it is what we have to do. We have to talk about these things. We have to educate people. And if that means we have to hold a rally, then that's what we have to do. And so it's changing this whole mindset of traditional roles that we're sort of used to. People on the right are going to have to get active. They're going to have to activate, and they're going to have to get loud, if they want to protect and sway public opinion in our direction. And that's going to take some education.
You said something about funding their market, and that's what they do is governments, along with their corporate sponsors, basically fund activism. So Greenpeace, although it might sound like it's great, they are heavily publicly funded to twist a narrative. And what I find from a rural perspective is you need to humble yourself to Mother Nature. You can't control, although we've been in, somewhat of a drought the last couple of years. We know that the rains are going to come again, and we're going to have sloughs full and battling too much water at a certain point. So now is the time, while it's dry, to basically do the ditches or put in tile and so on and so forth to drain those spots. So you have to humble yourself to Mother Nature. What I find with most of the bigger cities, if they created a concrete jungle, that they control every aspect and they think that their wisdom they can control. But I beg them to basically look at this. What city has ever made it centuries and centuries? The answer is none. They've all crumbled down, did their time, they've been rebuilt, they're in the same location, but they don't last forever. So Mother Nature deteriorates them all on their own. So, but my fields, they haven't deteriorated. They're still here. They haven't changed. They've changed about what's growing on them, but not necessarily the ground hasn't changed. So there's a lot of humbling to, walk with Mother Nature with her, not battle her and control her, because you never are.
Richard, I'd argue we've actually improved the land. Like when we look back 40, 50 years ago, soil organic matter on the top 4 inches is better than it ever has been, particularly on the prairies here. So that it's degrading, I don't think so. There may be isolated pockets that you've seen some changes, but the changes I've seen have all been to the positive. But what I want to talk about a little bit here is number 14.4, where they talk about regulating harvesting and overfishing. And this ties into what you guys were just talking about here. Who controls, who does what, and who pays. Because when we look at the top 10 countries who are out there harvesting in the oceans, whether it's whale fishing, well, Japan, Norway, Iceland, Greenland, Canada, United States, Russia, South Korea, those are the people that are in these waters fishing right now. And when we look at who's signed on with the UN and who isn't, it's very evident that the people that aren't signed on, and we saw this with Japan, they withdrew their membership, said, we're not having this because we love our whale fishing, we love our activities at sea. And so whatever we do on our coastlines are going to be exploited by others who aren't part of this deal.
Right.
How do you think we're going to win? And the answer is we're not, because when you have conglomerates like Russia, huge land masses, they've got water all around, except for some of their areas they lack year-round water access. But Japan, they're not giving up anytime soon. South Korea, are you kidding me? Like, who is going to regulate this, and who's going to think that it's going to be effective? And again, we're talking about what we've explored, and that's 5% of the ocean. So what about the other 95%? It's mind-boggling how they think that Canada's coast is now going to change global climate change, or is going to be able to be regulated. And the other thing that I think of, and we talked about the tanker ban earlier. So just so our audience understands, there are laws at the speeds that the tankers can come in and out of port, and that's 7 knots. And that's not to create any wake or any disturbances. It's also to any whales that are passing by, that they're not going to get, accidentally, where they have a connection with a boat or a vessel. It's not going to happen. But the interesting thing, law enforcement is exempt. So they can go as fast as they want, anytime they want, on any body of water. Again, too, like even if they're surveying or doing testing and so on and so forth, they're not. They are exempt from any of the rules. And so it always speaks to this 2-tiered system where they can do whatever they jolly well want. The rest of us have to toe the line. I want to talk about 14.3, acidification. This is a big deal. A lot of people don't understand, pH and, what the scale is and so on and so forth. And I understand that. Not everybody needs to get into the technical end. But when we talk about acidic waters on the pH scale, whether it's the human body, blood types, and those kind of things, they all fall on the same scale. So 0 to 6 is acidic, 7 is neutral, and 8 to 14 are basic. So when we look at what our oceans are currently, and for the last 200 years that we've been mapping them, we've been a steady 8.25 to 8.14 as a pH. And so what the UN is saying, well, we have changed by 30%. And it's like, well, 30% of what? And so then now you have to do some math. You got to get your calculator out and do some logarithms. Get out your grade 12 math. And so, 30%, if their numbers are correct, and I'm suspecting that the data that was done in 1751 is not as accurate as what we have today in 2023. So that's 0.1%. That's what the number is. So you're telling me that the ocean as a whole, again, we've only explored 5% of it. You can conclusively say that it has changed by 0.1%. And like, are you kidding me? But here's the part that gets me the most is when you look at aquatic life, they can survive in waters and they can thrive in waters between 6.5 and a pH of 9. Where does 8.25 fall in? Where does 8.14 fall in? We are well within the range. So if we take their word for it, and we've only changed by 0.1% over 200 years, for us to drop from 8.25 to 6.25, how many thousands of years is that going to take? Technology is going to change, things are going to change, but that we need to have an instant impact here where everything is regulated, and it's not clear what the regulations actually are. But the sense I have, it's going to be pretty catastrophic.
And are those regulations based on genuine modeling, or are we talking about modeling that's been manipulated and this is how they do it, and it all feeds the narrative, and ultimately the biggest part of this is control. So it's fear mongering, just like they do with everything else.
It's all fear mongering because we just see the populations aren't eating whales and fish as they were before. Protein shifted largely to poultry, and we've seen that there's been a reduction in beef. And in part, I think it is the fear mongering. You look at the BSE of 2008, the beef industry has barely recovered from that, and that has taken a lot of years. So poultry is the preferred for Canadians. So why are we getting blasted for fishing, and we're not overfishing? I don't think anybody is, aside from a few poachers or whatever, but that's another story. But we're talking about the mainstream here. This has just gone far too far. And the other thing, and you alluded to this the other night, is oceans are a major CO2 sink. So, this is a good place to put excess CO2 if there is some, like put it in a sink. So I just come up with so many questions that they are not able to actually give any reasonable types of answers to. When we talk about acidification, nitrification, we do have some pollutants, and as an agriculture, we're very aware of that. What our phosphorus does to rivers and streams, and eventually in the oceans if the waters are connected. But again, if they're not connected, if you have a phosphorus problem on your land and you're in the middle of Manitoba, where it goes absolutely nowhere, is it actually a problem? And I would argue that it isn't. There are maybe some years where we have some overland flooding, those once in a century floods. Yes, they would contribute to that year, but not as a whole. So again, we just, when we peel it apart and take away some of the layers, what they're presenting as a huge catastrophic problem and a big failure, we're addressing this ongoing. And as Richard mentioned, about doing ditching and putting in drain tile, all these kinds of things to help improve our land and also to route water and manage the water. This is a big deal because we look at the Mississippi levees and the floods they had. If they had used the models and the studies and done what they should have done, Mississippi would not have received the flooding it did, not 10 years ago. But they didn't implement them. They had maybe half or a quarter or whatever the number was. And therefore they had huge problems. They knew it was ticking. And, we look at Winnipeg here, Duff's Ditch. It was built at a time and said, you know what, the flood of the century will never happen again. And when we had the flood of 97, how much flooding did we have in Winnipeg? Marginal at best, because it did what it was designed to do, and that was to reroute water. We are very proactive and we are doing things,
And we always will. We're humans. That's what we do. We adapt, right? We solve problems and we innovate and we create and build. It's what we do, and we'll always will.
So why do you suppose, gentlemen, that these people that are implementing or overseeing these goals and these targets, they're very married to this narrative, and demonizing, the different industries as we're seeing. But let's talk a moment about the impact that humans are having on ocean life in the form of surveying and putting in these wind farms. So, and what that's doing and the impact that it's having on ocean life. Right now as we speak, there's a lot of drama going on over in the New Jersey area, if I'm not mistaken. 7 whales have come, they're on shore dead, and they're so married to this narrative that now the AP has come out with a statement saying that, oh, they were struck by a vessel, all 7 of them. So, but don't you think that when they're trying to convince humanity of these targets, and I'm trying to come from a perspective of the audience here, so bear with me. When I'm looking at this and I'm hearing, the wording that we want human activity is endangering the oceans and seas. Well, you're darn right it is. The people out there that are putting the wind farms in are doing it as we speak. But yet, all hail, wind power. So how they're contradicting themselves there, and they're really avoiding. There were reports, they were sounding alarm bells early on. I mean, there's some really good articles that came out in 2015 that were published about this, and But is that hitting the mainstream news? Not at all.
No, you're exactly right. It's not, because we talked about this in a previous episode, where the wind farms are changing the local ecosystems of the waters that they're situated in. You only think of the amount of drill rigs, the amount of concrete, the excavating for all these, these piles to support these massive structures. And then once they're functional, we know that these wind farms displace and create wind turbulence, and they also slow it down, which has a heating effect on the horizontal temperatures of the waters. So fish that were previously able to survive in that water now no longer can tolerate the temperature because the temperature has changed. And again, we look because the water movement is now slowing down, so nutrients and sediment is building up in and around these wind farms, and now we're displacing the what would be the basin of the oceans or rivers wherever these are situated, and you have a heating effect on the water on the top surface. Now you've created a very narrow window, or perhaps even remove that window, where these fish and other water species are able to survive and thrive in. And so what the long-term fallouts are is we don't know exactly, because nobody's really studying these, because why study something when you could potentially expose that these wind farms are doing more harm than good? And you could argue that at this point, because if we're concerned about the aquatic life, anywhere where you have wind farms, aquatic life is disturbed and disrupted.
Well, wind farms are really bad at making wind, and energy. They're horrible for making energy, but they're very good at transferring wealth to prop up a narrative. And that's what we're seeing. And with every SDG, basically, it's a small entity again that's trying to gain control of the oceans, which is another part of the world that they're trying to control. And that's what every one of these say things, all 17 of these say, is basically a small entity wants to control the world.
Okay, so here's a question for you guys. In this description of this SDG, it actually talks about the ocean absorbs around 1/4 of the world's annual carbon dioxide emissions, thereby mitigating climate change and alleviating its impacts. Yet in previous SDGs, we're talking about going to net zero by 2050. So how does that work?
Well, I mean, this whole agenda is one big contradiction and built on a mountain of hypocrisy. So it's not surprising.
They're outing themselves right there, Mark. It's right there in their wording.
It speaks again to the whole idea that Mother Nature knows what she's doing, and she'll look after things, and all we're doing is recycling what Mother Nature gave us in the first place. And it's all part of this cycle of life. And thanks, oceans, for doing what you do. Thanks, trees, for doing what you do. And, and as there's more CO2, that'll actually just create more green.
And here's the other thing. One of the things they're proposing is to farm seaweed in the oceans. So, and this is where I really would exercise a lot of caution. Because again, we don't know a lot of the long-term effects of what we are doing when we're creating infrastructure and like something like farming at sea with seaweed. We don't know what the fallout is going to be. Do we know whether the ecosystem that is currently there is going to be displaced, or will they thrive even better than what they are? We don't know a lot of these things, and to just go ahead and start making changes, and we haven't done the research yet. The jury's still out on this, and it's like, why are we implementing this?
Which is ultimately why I refer to this as the unsustainable agenda, because that's exactly what it is. It's none of it is sustainable. None of it fits within Mother Nature. None of it fits within, humanity and what we need to survive as a species.
I kind of remember, Mark, going back to my grade 9 science book, and if we had to get together in groups and put together a report about what we thought after, reading about carbon life and photosynthesis and carbon being the foundation of all life on Earth, and then come up with a grade 9 level research report, and had these 17 goals, and we presented these goals, I'm pretty sure we would have flunked hard.
And if we look at number 14.5, the target, again, to conserve at least 10% of coastal and marine areas. And it's consistent with national and international law and based on scientific information. So, like, who determines the scientific information? Who decides which 10%? And could that be swayed by dollars and cents? Because as we know, some of these scientists, they pipe to the highest bidder. So, it's one of those things. Would Canada have their coastline protected and the United States wouldn't, or Russia wouldn't? So again, where's the benefit? It just makes so little sense that you would be able to put an arbitrary number on there and say, this is what we're going to do. Well, what about the other 90%? They don't deserve to be protected? Who gets to pick and choose? And their science is very subjective because they couldn't agree on a single number. Because as I was doing some research on acidification, I came up with numbers that were from 7.0 to 8.25. That's a huge spectrum because, again, we're using algorithms. And so I finally settled on the 8.25 and 8.14. But it's like a tenfold magnitude of discrepancies. This is not a rounding error. We have some pretty darn good calculators, and
but yeah, but we know most of their models are contrived. Most of their models are manipulated to reach an outcome that works with the narrative, and that's what they do with all of this stuff.
They pick a number and then reverse engineer it.
Yep, 100%.
That's a wrap, folks. We would like to thank you so much for joining us in this journey. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with others on your social media platforms. Thanks again for listening.